Welcome to the Innovators and Investors Podcast. I'm Kristian Marquez, founder and CEO of Finstrat Management. At Finstrat, we provide CFO-led accounting, finance, and reporting services to assist clients monetize their business. Stick around to the end of the podcast and I'll share how you can be our next guest. Now on to the show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Innovators and Investors Podcast. I'm your host, Kristian Marquez, CEO and founder of Finstrat Management. With us today, we have Andrew Hoag. Andrew is a co-founder and CEO of Dash Labs, as well as the creator of Workstation. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kristian. Great to be here.
Oh, hey, great to have you on. So let's start with Dash Labs. Fill us in. What's the company focused on?
Yeah, so this is my third entrepreneurial journey as kind of founder CEO. I met my co-founder about a year ago, and we started spitballing a lot of ideas in and around the space around AI. And I think we really got excited about how AI is going to continue to change work, right? And there's a lot of attention around AI with regards to enterprise. But for us, there's a lot of second order effects that I think people are glossing over, right? There's a lot of attention around agents and automation and all these things. But most of my companies in the past have been very focused on the human experience. And we think that's sort of being left out of the conversation.
Hmm.
And so we're building a product called Workstation, which is a productivity app that helps employees use AI more effectively at work and still provides the enterprise with comfort around safety and security. And there's a few things about Workstation that I'm really excited about. One is just your ability to collaborate with your colleagues. Two is the ability to use different models. One of the things that we've realized a lot of people don't understand is that the different models have different personalities and strengths.
Hmm.
And ChatGPT isn't always the leader for certain use cases.
Mhm.
Sometimes you want a little, snarky point of view from Grok. Sometimes you want the smooth, penmanship of Claude. And sometimes you want a little more scientific technical rigor from GPT-5. And so, the ability to use different models, collaborate with your coworkers, and then really just make AI accessible. We have this tagline of use AI like an engineer. And
Hmm.
we think that, your rank and file employees coming from other roles outside of engineering should benefit from best in class AI tools.
Well, so it's interesting. Most of the conversations I've participated in around models have been whether it's small or large LLMs and the associated use case and then by consequence cost. But it sounds like you're just taking this what's a good way to describe it? More liberal, non-engineering view, even though it's for engineers, that I have heard anecdotally or participated in conversations about how to think, like Grok being snarky, but hadn't really thought about in just broader applications. So what was the genesis behind pursuing the fact that you're right, that these seem to have different personalities?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was just our own experimentation and realization, right? And as we started interviewing users, we realized like they'll consult, especially people that are still curious and maybe they're skeptical a little bit about AI and they'll kind of consult with different models to try to see to get different answers, right? Obviously, in enterprise, Copilot is a very big one, and everybody's familiar with Copilot. They all say it sucks, but they're not really able to articulate why. And so, understanding like, hey, how would Copilot answer this? How would GPT-5 answer this? And we're obviously dog fooding our own product. I'm a big believer in that. And so as we started to put together some of our marketing materials, I would run a benchmark. And, our product allows you to do that very easily of like compare the different models. And I saw like the difference was very dramatic.
Hmm.
And it's a great demo of kind of what the power is behind this. So GPT-5 gave me, a very bulleted, detailed, almost like technical list, kind of like something that somebody would fire off really quickly and indent a bunch of bullets and things like that. And Claude gave you something more that a copywriter would write. And it was more elegant and more well-formed and those kinds of things. So, I think that's been a big part of it. And what we've realized is that there's a lot of people that are outside of the technical jobs, right? Product managers or engineering are the ones that you read about using AI. But if you go to marketing, revenue operations, sales, finance, et cetera, they know that the AI is really powerful and they're kind of like playing with it in some of their tools, but they know that they could be doing more, but they're not sure how. And so, you know, with Workstation, we see a really important mission to kind of help users do more with AI, and also learn from their colleagues and just feel more successful with it. And I think there's a big opportunity there as people want to grow and develop their AI skills, but they're not sure where to start.
So what do you finger is the current rate limiting step as to why more people aren't being aggressive with adoption?
I mean, there's the cynical version of that, which is humans are lazy. And then there's the practical version of that, which is there's a lot of jargon and the space is moving insanely fast.
Mm.
And so, you know, I'll give you an example, right? There's a technical, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, right? But there's a technical thing around models of like what's called in context learning. And so the idea between in context learning is that you no longer need to fine tune a model, but you actually can, you know, give it information in the prompt in the context of the model to actually help it learn and give better results. The simplest way to describe this is you give it examples. But if you go to someone and say you're not doing in context learning, it's very confusing and technical versus like just the ability of like, hey, what's an example of the thing you're looking for is a great way to like create in context learning. And so we're at such an early stage of this, right? We're at the, you know, Web 1.0, like not even Web 1.0 version of this. And people are still figuring out HTTP and, you know, what a query parameter is like I'm dating myself now, but like the early web and the internet. And so we're trying to make that a lot more packaged and easier for people to use. And I think that's a bit of the opportunity. So I think it can be intimidating and everybody just feels guilty because they know they should be doing more, but then they start to research it and there's, you know, hundreds of millions of YouTube videos. There's all kinds of tweets of you should be doing it this way, you should be doing it that way. And it's hard to know where to get started.
Oh, so would love to hear the vision. If we fast forward a year or two or three from now, what does Workstation look like and how has it evolved?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's obviously one we think about a lot, right? As Sun Tzu said, Lao Tzu, sorry, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Probably paraphrasing that a little bit, but I think for us, you know, if we fast forward, right, we just want to give people superpowers, and the goal is to make them feel like they're accomplished in using AI. Right? There's no reason that everybody in an organization who's using some level of chatbot or agent should not be able to do that through Workstation, and I think that's really interesting. Giving people a single pane of glass. Oh, I hate that. I always get to re-edit those. Giving people a single pane of glass where they can actually look through and see all the things that their AI is doing. And I think that's like really powerful when you start to fast forward in the future. There's a famous investor pundit called Balaji, from used to be at Andreessen, and Balaji talks about how AI is middle to middle. And we think in the current conversation, the humans are going to be around for quite a while and the humans are going to move into the role of orchestrators. And so
Hmm.
as Workstation becomes that single pane of glass, which I cannot say today, as Workstation, start over, as Workstation becomes that single pane of glass, we see the humans elevating into the role of orchestration. And I think that's really valuable. And that's really how we feel like the near term future is going to evolve.
Do you have a demographic in mind who you think is going to be your sweet spot, or are you still experimenting?
Yeah, we're obviously very experimental with that. Is you know that what I think is the demographic usually is something different than what reality works out to be. But you know, in terms of the future of work, right, we do see a lot of the individual contributor jobs being um, automated away in a sense, right? So people who are doing rote repetitive tasks and just kind of, you know, one of my friends describes it as labor that scales with the business model. So if you're scaling your revenue, you have a multiplier of like for every $1 million of revenue, we add two salespeople, right? That labor we actually think is the easiest to kind of agentify and start to automate. But what happens when you have that then is you have more coordination complexity up further up the chain. So managers, operational analysts, right? People that need to stitch together disparate data. Um, that I think is the role where there's a lot of unmet need. And I think that's where work moves into. And we already see that a little bit with the coders, where they're running a bunch of sub agents and they're able to get a lot more leverage and kind of 10x their output. We think that's available for everyone in the organization, but that's going to move them more into this role of coordination and orchestration.
Got it. Well, super exciting stuff. And I mean, it sounds like the timing is perfect. because I would agree with you. It's definitely early innings, maybe even the first.
Yeah.
So I have a feeling if we were to fast forward 10 years, night and day different, flip phone to smartphone different.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
so,
Unrecognizable future.
mhm. Yeah, earlier you mentioned um, you've been a founder 3 times, was it? Leading up to
Founder
this?
CEO 3 times, been on the founding cap table probably about six.
Oh,
So
wow.
been
Okay.
around the hoop for a long time.
I would love to hear what the progression experience was like.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I got to entrepreneurial kind of, life later. I think a little bit. I did my first decade was government and corporate.
Mhm.
So started my career as an engineer on the technology side, built supercomputers at NASA, and then was at VeriSign and did cryptography and cybersecurity. And that kind of was really a proving ground. And that was like early dot-com days and like going through all that. Started my first company in 2008. I think we launched 6 products over 4 years. The last one, we got a little bit of tailwind behind, and we sold that in 2012, um, which was a small exit, but a lot of founder tuition during those 4 years. I took a couple years off, traveled, worked abroad, and then really just kind of got the itch. I think the problem is once a founder, always a founder. It's very hard to go work for someone else at this point. And I really love building things. And I really love building things from scratch. And so in 2016, moved to New York and started building my next company, TeamPay, which we scaled pretty aggressively. We raised a good amount of capital for that, over 70 million in capital for that company. And we sold that in 2023. And that was a great lesson because, we had 110, 120 employees, really got to see kind of moving through from an idea that I built myself, the prototype, all the way through to a company at scale that was supporting hundreds of enterprises as well as 500,000 employees and scaling the sales team, scaling the operations. Every 12 to 18 months, something breaks and you have to go back and fix it. So it was a really good journey in the operational side. And then after about 18 months between that company and then this one, just kind of got the itch again and came back and started working with my co-founder, Steve, to start building Dash.
Wow. And so, biggest lessons learned over the years that have stuck with you.
Oh, there's so many. I think one of the things that's really important with founders is that you need to have a bias for action.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is I've seen a lot of people get wrapped around the analysis of what should I do, how should I do it, uh, and the only information. And Steve Blank, back in the day, had a really good kind of example of this. All the information is outside the building. Everything, all the information is out there, right? And when you're doing a startup, it's very easy, and I was guilty of this in my first company, to just focus on product. And what actually ended up getting that company sold was a pivot away from our initial idea. And I just, because I was good at building product, that was my safe zone. And I kept overbuilding on product.
Mm.
And so we had this barnacled Frankenstein thing that was like 20 different apps and it did a bunch of stuff, but didn't serve anything really well. And we pivoted to something really simple and really straightforward. And that was like really important. And so I think, the ability to kind of stay focused throughout that, and have that bias for action where you can go get feedback in the market and tighten those feedback loops is super important. There's been a lot that's written about this, but it's one of those, do as I say, not as I do type things. And I think having that bias for action is like really, really important along the way.
Um, yeah, it's I think everyone enjoys doing the familiar. There's a dopamine rush there.
And
Uh,
what's safe.
and what's safe.
Yeah. And I've seen founders on both sides of that, right? I've seen founders that are commercially oriented and sales oriented, and they have a huge order book, and the customers stick around for a few months because the product doesn't work,
Mm.
right? And I see founders that are very product oriented, and when things get tight or crazy or they're uncertain, they go back and add more product. And adding a feature is almost never solved a go to market problem. And so it takes a lot of discipline to stay balanced. And even in the new company, right, I feel myself gravitating towards product because that's my safe zone and that's where I'm comfortable. Even though I know that like we need to go out into the market and get feedback and start to talk, start to get users using the product and all those kinds of things. So there's very much a comfort zone of like where people gravitate towards and what's their safe space. And a lot of being a founder, frankly, is just getting out of that comfort zone every day.
So for founders who say space is a product, what do you think the gap is for making sales happen?
Yeah. I mean, there's two kind of approaches there, right? Like one approach is find a co-founder where that's their strong suit.
Hmm.
um, and get, the challenge there is obviously is if that's your go-to and you have a co-founder who's different, they're different, right? Heterogeneous teams are by definition a bunch of different people, and it could feel very uncomfortable to have a sales-oriented co-founder that's out there selling far ahead of where you are in the delivery, right? I've
Sure.
seen a lot of founders, they're like, oh my God, this salesperson's crazy and they're promising all these things and we're not ready yet. We won't be ready for 97 days, and it's like, none of that stuff matters, right? Like you got to get people who actually want it. So one approach is finding a co-founder to balance that out, and the other approach is really just recognizing. I think some of it is just self-awareness, and there's a lot of inner work that
Hmm.
founders have to do around self-awareness of like, am I going back to the thing that's safe? And this kind of mantra that I have of like, nothing is real until you actually get that feedback from outside the building. And
Hmm.
just, you got to, like, it's almost like a mantra, like every day, how do I get more feedback from customers? How do I have more conversations? How do I kind of just sanity check myself along the way? So I think you need a certain amount of that self awareness and self discipline to be able to do that. And just make sure that you're kind of exercising the uncomfortable muscles, right? It's like, if you're good in the gym at certain exercises, you just always do those exercises, and you actually need to do the ones that you're not good at in order to balance things out.
So any tips or tricks or any hacks that you learned over the years as to how to get better feedback from the market?
Yeah. There's a very famous book called The Mom Test. And so, this idea of your mom is always going to tell you that you're doing a great job and she loves the product. And I can give a quick narrative. Like, I suffered through that in my last company. So, on my last company, um, which was my second one, right? I was like, great, this is awesome. I'm in the matrix. I know what's coming, the first 18 months, all of that, right? And we launched the product. We built the product really quickly. I had a really good founding engineering team. We got the product out in the market. And I had a bunch of people. I had this like wait list, right? The wait list of like all these friends and colleagues and people that I met that are like, oh, this is so exciting. We're really excited to use it. And we launched the product to them. And after 4 months, we had zero engagement. And there was a moment where I was just like, oh my God, I just wasted a whole bunch of time and people's money. And I'm crazy and I'm the only crazy one. There's certainly something in the jobs quote around that. I'm the only one who's crazy. And what I realized was two things. One is that I had distributed the product to a bunch of my peers and they just weren't as excited about it as they said they were, or they didn't have really the same pain point. So the signal isn't in the response, the signal is in the usage.
Sure.
And we didn't have the usage. So one was distributing to a bunch of my peers, and two was like actually figuring out for the product we built, who's got that problem that we solve and continuing to run more experiments. And so we ended up getting an introduction from one of our investors who, I was being very transparent about where we were in this journey. Unfortunately, we'd raised a little bit of money. So we had about 15 more months to figure this out. And I think because I was a second time founder, I was much more laissez faire about like, okay, we'll figure this out. Like this didn't work. I need to go find a different market. And so one of our investors through their network introduced us to someone cold who's like, I think this guy's kind of weird, like you're weird, and you two should talk. And he's got a similar PV on the market. And sure enough, he was. And he had a whole bunch of product feedback, of which we took probably 10%. But It was a much larger company than we'd been talking to by about 5 times bigger. So, we were talking to companies between 20 to 30 employees. This was a 150 person company. And we're like, what's going to break if we actually onboard the customer? And second of all, I made sure they paid. And the other companies I was giving away to free and trying to get free feedback and these kinds of things, right? So they didn't have skin in the game. And so, as Josh Koppelman calls it, solving the penny problem, getting someone who has skin in the game, it's huge. It's a step function, right? And then second of all, we realized that the product we built better served larger organizations. And all of a sudden, they started using it. Engagement went through the roof. He started getting love letters from his users. We started circulating to other companies that looked like that company, and we had similar results. And then we knew we were onto something. And, we went from serving 100 users to a year later serving companies with 1,500 employees, which was a massive amount of growth for us, but like super exciting, and just continued scaling beyond that all the way to post IPO companies. But I got the segment wrong for the
Mm.
first 4 months and really kind of failed my own mom test. And I had to go out there and put on my big boy pants and talk to strangers and cold call and talk to people that I hadn't met before and understand their pain points and try to make a match. And fortunately, we were able to do that.
And so what was the degree you incorporated that into Dash Labs? What you learned?
We're just starting. So I'm about to go through that right now. Obviously, we want a product that's accessible to everyone, not just the enterprise. So that's going to be a slightly different thing. And we spend a lot of time talking to users. We have an idea of what we think we can deliver. And, over the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to figure that out. But, I think the other piece of advice related to this go to market that I tend to give entrepreneurs when I'm advising and mentoring them is you got to think of it almost as a series of experiments to the point where sometimes I'll even start to make a spreadsheet. We have a spreadsheet inside Dash Labs of like, here's who we think the target customer is. Here's what we think their problem or message is. Here's what we think the product features are that they need. And you run through that spreadsheet like there's a combination. I think of it almost like in tuples, where each row is an experiment and you run through those experiments. You can do a couple in parallel, probably not all of them, but you don't want to do them all sequentially either because you're kind of trying to cast, lines in the water to see where the fish bite. So we've got a few of those experiments we're running right now, and you have to maintain that experimental mentality. And one of the things that I see founders doing is they end up trying to like drive the truck like down a single road. And if you actually can like run some experiments, it becomes a lot more valuable because you get feedback more quickly. You're able to take that in parallel and then understand where you should double down. So I think that's like really important, is having that experimental mentality and being Socratic about how you approach this thing. So over the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to go run some experiments.
Love it. You mentioned investors. What's your experience been in raising outside capital?
Oh, wow. That's a loaded question. Everything from fantastic to terrible. So I've seen it
Let's start
all.
with terrible.
Oh man. I mean, there's pre and post investment. I mean, I think like one of the things that founders often forget. I helped a founder last year who was struggling with their Series A fundraise. They had really good metrics in the business and had created, the investors are throwing a bunch of objections at them, and they created a very defensive kind of pitch. They're like, well, we're going to take care of this. And they're trying to take care, they're just fingers in the dike, right? And when I dug into the business, I was like, look, your business is actually doing amazingly well. You're in the top quartile, if not top decile of companies. You're in a very unique category. You have a chance to be category leader, right? So I think what a lot of founders forget is that the investors need the companies more than the companies need the capital,
Hmm.
because the company can go on its own, right? And capital is fungible and basically a commodity, whereas the companies are not. And so and investors always want to make that power dynamic about them, right? Because if you have a commodity, you've got to find a way to like
Hmm.
leverage that commodity. So I've had all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, I had one investor tell me I should go have a baby, which I thought was really interesting. I had another investor tell me I should work on hand sanitizers, which was also like super interesting. And, at the end of the day, you have to develop a pretty thick skin. I think with some empathy for the other side of it too, is that there's a lot going on for the investors as well. And I think a lot of founders just look at them as like a faucet of money. That's not the way it works.
Sure.
And so you've got to realize like you need to match that investor's thesis and their fund structure and their politics in a way that's a very unique and kind of opaque fit. And that all has to line up. And you could have a great investor at the wrong time. You could have a great investor at the wrong fund. You could have a great investor with the right thesis and everything else. But they just did a massive deal 2 weeks before and they can't do another deal right now. So, like, there's all these opaque factors that are happening on the other side of it. As I've seen a little more how the sausage is made. So, I think, there is some empathy there. And at the end of the day, you need to run a process. So, kind of summarizing a little bit of this, I think the two things that matter a lot, even more than the investors want to admit, is running a very disciplined process,
Mhm.
meaning structure, outreach, stages, follow ups, just running a very tight, executing a very tight process matters. And I do think humans are very susceptible to narrative. And having the narrative and having that nailed is really important. And founders tend to overtell the story and they tend not to simplify it enough. And so I think the narrative matters. So I think you can get really far with process and narrative. And I think that's where a lot of founders have more control over the fundraising process than they would like to admit, and oftentimes fall down.
What are your thoughts on investors who've been founders or operators themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I generally prefer that. I mean, I don't think it's a panacea, but I think, someone who comes from having sat in the seat can be really valuable. Maybe not for advice, but just in terms of empathy, right? Just
Mm.
in terms of understanding their position um, as capital. And I think the more dangerous investors I've seen are people who come from capital and think they can operate, and that can be very toxic.
Interesting. Yeah, I find myself in that conversation often is as investors seek to differentiate themselves, as having been in the trenches, an advantage. And generally speaking, the I find that the conversations go to yes, because the advice that investors are going to give founders is generally rooted in experience. And,
Yeah,
I presume the ones who told you about the baby and hand sanitizer have been career investors, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
you are right.
Good stuff. Well, Andrew, really enjoyed this. One of the things I asked you earlier, the key takeaways, but if you think back and you had to start all over again,
Mm,
anything you would have done completely different?
yeah, it's I get that question a lot, and I think for me, being a founder is a series of it's tens of thousands of small decisions that tend to compound,
Mhm.
right? And so I think there's kind of this catch 22 of like you want the decisions to compound in the right way, but you're not going to get every decision right. And so understanding really critically about which decisions you have to get right, I think is super important, kind of a one-way door versus two-way door model. And for the decisions that I have to get right or that have a one-way door attached, I tend to go very slow and I tend
Mm.
to recruit a lot of advice, right? I tend to be very diligent in reaching out to my network and asking folks and trying to talk to other founders and entrepreneurs. For the decisions that are a little more two-way doors, and we all think decisions are big, but not all decisions are actually big. You can actually unwind a lot more than you think. So for the decisions that are two-way doors, then you try to move fast and just keep moving. Um, I'm a very action oriented type person. My Enneagram is very action oriented, and so I find this ability to keep moving is really important because the market is moving at the same time. And so, I've seen people basically get lapped by the market. Maybe if they had kept pace or been moving, they would have been okay. But sometimes the market can outpace you. And you know, not all good ideas are executed upon. So having that bias for action, coming back to that, and then being able to make decisions and give yourself permission to make mistakes, because often from those mistakes you learn the most.
Mm. Do you have a heuristic that you use trying to decide which if the doors are one way or bi-directional?
Um, yeah, I mean, there's probably a few factors like one-way doors, like, taking an investor on the board,
Hmm.
right, is kind of a one-way door. You can't really fire board members. Or if you can, like, it can be very difficult and painful. Um, Taking an investor on your cap table who doesn't really have any rights, they can be annoying, but they really can't do much. So like understanding like what's the real like power dynamic there. Um, Launching products and features are always two-way doors. So, there's companies like Amazon where we've forgotten more of the products they've launched than they've actually succeeded,
Yeah.
right? And so there's all those kinds of things. And I think, there's some companies do a really good job of just continuing to execute. And then on the two-way door side, it's like, what's the back to my Socratic experimental method, like what's the cheapest experiment I can run to get validation? And so all those experiments I think of almost as two-way doors, right? Can I run a small experiment to get a little more information? Because you're never going to have enough information to start.
Well, so it's interesting. So capital and time are really intuitive, but I'm also hearing that, you'll consider friction as
Yes.
an example. And it makes sense. I know it's something I don't hear a lot of people talk about is, just mental capital.
Yep.
It's real.
Focus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in focus, right? And I think being able to focus on a number, and generally founders can hold a lot of things in their head and they're multitaskers, but the ability to focus is like super, super important. And it's very easy, even as things start to work, to get distracted. And I
Mm,
think focus really, really is so important. And it's even more important, right? Um, I had an engineer that said it really well to me once that I thought was like super interesting.
mm,
Completely technical, but it was like a really interesting marketing thing of like if you're in a crowded room and there's a bunch of people having a conversation and everybody's just kind of talking generally, it's very hard to pick out a
hmm
particular person or a particular voice. But if you're in that crowded room and you just keep saying exactly the same thing over and over and over and over, and just that one thing, you can pull that out of the conversation very clearly. So
hmm
focus is like a knife and it can cut very sharply. And I think that's really important as, markets and, noise and all these things that we're trying to punch above.
That's interesting. Um, yeah, being deliberate with your attention is extremely valuable.
Yeah.
And you're right, everyone's competing for it.
Yeah.
So, any hacks that you've adopted to separate the the signal from the noise?
It's a constant battle. I don't think there's a silver bullet there. I think it's just continuing to kind of check in and be self-aware about it. I think it's
Mm,
continuing to like, I do a lot of like list making. I do a lot of like just talking with my co-founder of like, here's the things I'm going to do. So a little bit of it is putting it out there and then maintaining that commitment. But yeah, it's easy to get distracted, and sometimes distractions are good. You just have to have some judgment and understand like how much am I going to invest in this distraction, right? The only thing you can't raise more of is time. And
yeah.
so the time becomes really precious. And the consequence of lack of focus is loss of time. And that's the one thing in life that we haven't figured out how to get more.
Agreed. Now, it'd be interesting though if any of these biotech products that I read about in the pipeline are true, then you may be able to buy more time, but we will see.
Yeah.
In terms of opportunity costs, I 100% agree. Um, Andrew, before we wrap up, I really appreciate your time, but also would love to extend you an opportunity to give a shout out to anybody, personally or professionally, who's had a material impact on you over the years.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many people. I think, Jonathan Lowenhar, who connected us, has been a big mentor and influence in my life. And I think there's so many founders that came before me and did these podcasts, talked about things, and early investors that switched from being an operator to an investor and played a lot inside baseball. So yeah, extremely, extremely grateful for standing on the shoulders of giants.
Fantastic. Awesome. Andrew, super excited to see Workstation come to life. If there's anyone in the audience who wants to learn more, how can they find you or
Yeah,
where to go?
check us out at workstation.ai.
Perfect. And with that, again, for the benefit of our audience, Andrew Hoag, co-founder and CEO of Dash Labs, and now the creator of Workstation. Andrew, thank you again and appreciate your time.
Amazing. Thanks, Christian.
Our pleasure. And again, thank you for joining us for another episode, the Innovators Investors Podcast. I'm your host, Kristian Marquez, CEO, founder of Finstrat Management. Take care. Kristian Marquez here. Thank you so much for listening to the Innovators and Investors Podcast. If you're a successful founder or an investor who would like to be on the podcast, please visit podcast.finstratmgmt.com/podcast-guest. If you've got something out of this interview, please share this episode on social media. If you know someone that would be a great guest, please tag them on social media to let them know about the show and include the hashtag Innovators and Investors. I'd love to see your posts and suggestions. We're regularly putting out new episodes and content. To make sure you catch each new episode, please subscribe to the Innovators and Investors Podcast. And your thumbs up, ratings, and reviews go a long way to help promote the show, and it means a lot to me and my team. Would you like to know more? Go to our website, finstratmgmt.com, or follow us on LinkedIn or on X. Our handle is @finstratmgmt. This is Kristian Marquez. Thank you for listening. Until next time.